morning and welcome to the Orkney International Science Festival online. My name is Heather Woodbridge and it is my pleasure to be hosting this session from North Ronaldsay in Orkney today. The Orkney International Science Festival is entering its 30th anniversary this year, and we are marking this occasion with our very first online festival. This year, we are delighted to bring a full festival programme to you wherever you are at this moment. And today, I'm joined by three speakers who I believe are all joining us from mainland Orkney. We've got Mike Bell, Jack Sheeny, and Katie Cubbin. So hello and welcome. Dr. Mike Bell is a research fellow at Heriot-Watt University's Orkney campus, where he is being engaged in research and teaching for the last 12 years. Originally from Tring in Hertfordshire, he has had previous incarnations as a wetlands ecologist with a bird conservation charity, a shellfish advisor with a government agency, and an independent fishery research consultant. He provides science in support of sustainable fishery initiatives by Orkney's fishing industry and lives in Rendell Parish with his wife, Bernie. And we also have Jack with us today. Jack Sheeny is originally from Maidenhead, just west of London, and just coming into his second year of his PhD, studying at ICIT in Stromness. He first moved up to Orkney in 2016 to teach scuba diving, and then completed a Master's in Science to complement his background in marine biology, before working in environmental and renewable energy consultancy. Jack's PhD is in blue carbon, and most recently he's been assisting in the teaching of economics and developmental appraisal for master's modules here in Stromness. This has sort of steered the direction of his research, attempting to link blue carbon value to stakeholders and also bridge the gap between academia and policy. Excellent. We also have Katie Cubbin today. Katie is about to start her second year of her PhD at the Heriot-Watt campus in Stromness. Originally from the Isle of Man, Katie moved to Edinburgh after studying marine biology at the Heriot-Watt Edinburgh campus. Following this, Katie went straight into a Master's of Science in Climate Change, Managing the Marine Environment, also at the Edinburgh campus. Katie first came to Orkney during the summer of 2018 to carry out her Master of Science thesis, which was based on fisheries and aquaculture interactions in Orkney, which has led to her current PhD project, Coexistence of Atlantic Salmon Aquaculture and Inshore Fisheries in Orkney, an exotoxicological approach to establish potential contamination pathways in commercially important crustacean species. Whew. It's a pleasure to welcome you all today. Hello, and thank you so much for coming. I believe we've got two films that are sort of linked with this talk today, and I believe they'll be going into the YouTube live chat at the moment, so you can catch those links just there. If you have any questions for our fabulous speakers this morning, please enter them into the YouTube live chat, and what we'll do is we'll come and revisit those at the end of the talks. Well, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Mike.
Thank you, Heather, and good morning, everybody. I'd like to start off by saying a few thank yous. Often I forget to say these at the end. Start off by saying thank you to Howie Firth for allowing us this opportunity. And the title is all Howie's. I think was inspired by our Heriot-Watt campus and the view from that, which you can see at the bottom of the screen. Well, to be strictly accurate, it's from the hill above, but it's the same view. Thank you also to Kathleen Hogarth and the whole of the Orkney International Science Festival team. We really felt in good hands in embarking on this event. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is some of the fantastic work that's being done by the research students in Orkney. Now, I'm based at Heriot-Watt University with our campus in Stromness. That's not the only academic institution in Orkney, so I will be trying to cover a little bit of what some of the other institutions are doing as well. So if we move to the next slide, we'll see what's on the agenda. I can't see the next slide. Here we are. Yes. So looking out to sea. Looking out to sea is a rather appropriate title for this, not only because of the view from our campus, but also because of the focus of an awful lot of the research that's done in Orkney. And I'll be telling you a little bit about the idea of Orkney as a living laboratory. I'll mention Heriot-Watt, which is obviously going to feature quite prominently, but I'll also talk about other universities that have a presence in Orkney. Then the main part of the presentations are about the students that we have in Orkney. So I'm going to read out some information provided by Fleur Ward, who's at the UHI Institute for Northern Studies, about the role of information and communications technology in island communities. And then we'll go live to Jack Sheehy, who's with us here at Heriot-Watt University, who's going to be talking about blue carbon. Now, at the beginning, Heather mentioned that there were a couple of films. You may already have seen these because these were premiering at 9:30. So we've got Mohammed. Mohammed has contributed a film on integration of tidal energy into island energy solutions. And just skipping Katie for just a second, Matthew Coleman also has contributed a film on crab tagging work. So both of those are PhD students, as is Katie. So Katie, I'm very pleased to say, will be talking live on her PhD to do with interactions of fisheries and aquaculture. So if we move to the next slide, I'll start setting a little bit of scene here. So I'm not sure who first came up with the idea of Orkney as a living laboratory. It might have been Gareth Davies in Aquaterra, but it's a phrase that's very commonly used right now with a lot of justice. Why should we be doing this research in Orkney? Well, why should we be doing this research at all, I suppose, is the first question. Now, I'd like during this morning session to dispel the idea that academic research is some kind of ivory tower that's not related in any sense to real life. I think what our speakers today will show is that very much is to do with real life. All research is or should be, and certainly is on the part of these students, about solving problems, about finding ways for people to live sustainably in the world and with each other. And that's quite a high calling, I think, and it is something that we need. We need the evidence, we need the science, we need the understanding to move forward into a more sustainable future. And that is happening in no small part due to the students. Well, what part does Orkney play in this? Well, I think if you're linking through to this particular science festival, you'll already be aware of the landscape, the culture, the resources, and a lot more that we have in Orkney. So this slide just shows, this is the Bay of Scale with some waves in it, waves full of energy. There's a lot of marine activities, both past and present. If we move through to the next slide, we can see there's an awful lot of other things going on to do with wildlife, culture, heritage, archaeology, both recent and much more distant in time. So on this slide, we've got a gargoyle from St Magnus Cathedral. We've got a World War II gun emplacement. We've got the Cairns archaeological dig on South Ronaldsea. Bottom right, we've got a lot of marine plastics. So there's a lot of human activities going on in Orkney, and that can cause a lot of issues as well. And if we move through to the next slide, I just want to make a little point about some of the fantastic seafood resources that we've have in Orkney. Not all of them exploited, actually, but they're exploited. Some of them have been exploited now, and some of them have been exploited in the past. So if you look at the top left, that's actually a shellfish midden, an Iron Age midden, I think, with a lot of cockle shells. And that's not a million miles away from the location of the bottom left slide, which is sandy sand in DNS. And you can see a beach littered with cockle shells there, a real resource, not particularly used actually. On the right, we have a lot more things that really are used, particularly the very prominent Orkney crab. And if you were able to watch Matthew's presentation, you will probably have seen something about that and the science that's underlying sustainability that's being demonstrated by the fisheries in Orkney. So moving on, I've talked about the environment in Orkney, but we should not forget there is a human resource here. And I could have picked a lot of different things here. This particular slide concentrates on some of the student presence in Orkney. So these are our master's students from previous years. We're about to have a new intake of master's students. They're arriving in Orkney right now, and we'll be welcoming them to our Orkney campus next week. But they're a really important part of our life there and undertake research of their own. We'll be talking about the PhD research today, but there's a great deal of research that these guys do over the summer. So can we move to the next slide, please? Before moving on, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about our fantastic campus that we have. And this is something that Howie was particularly keen to include in this presentation, as Howie's visited the campus, and he was particularly taken with a fantastic view that we have. And I should also acknowledge Colin Keldy of K4 Graphics, who has provided these brilliant pictures that we have. So this square-looking building, this oblong-looking building in the middle of the picture is our new campus, where we've been since about this time last year. And this is where Heriot-Watt resides with the Orkney Research and Innovation Campus, which is a wider initiative through Highlands and Islands Enterprise and Orkney Islands Council. So we've moved from an old secondary school building to an old primary school building, but you wouldn't recognize it as an old building. It really is a fantastic facility for us and really nicely situated above the harbour in Stromness. So if we can move on, we can see a little bit more of the outside and its setting, and a student lying back in the window there with some sense of the view that you get from the campus. And moving on, we can see a little bit of the inside. And that's a cue for me to mention another university that has a presence in the building, and that's Robert Gordon's University, who are establishing a presence in Orkney. They have an office on our same campus. Bottom right, you see the PhD room. This is where Jack and Katie both do their work, along with a number of other PhD students. And we're very pleased to have a real room full of young researchers here at the moment. So let's move on. I promised to say something about other academic presence in Orkney, to say that Heriot-Watt is not the only university in Orkney. I just mentioned Robert Gordon University that now have a presence at the Orkney Research and Innovation Campus. There's also the University of the Highlands and Islands, and UHI have a very long history of research in Orkney. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll just highlight the Archaeology Institute, and they have a good number of research students concentrating on the fantastic heritage, the historic and prehistoric built environment in particular in Orkney. And moving on to the next slide, we have some information about the Institute for Northern Studies, and I'll be providing a little excerpt of some of the research that one of the PhD students is doing there. There's not time for me to read out everything on this slide, but I think you can get the point of this really world-leading research institute and the kind of cultural, historical studies that are focusing particularly on island living and all that happens in islands, past and present. So if we move on, we can see a little bit about some of what they're doing. And I didn't realize this slide was animated, so maybe if you could press the button, Mick, we might see a list of their PhD students or their research. If you keep on pressing the button, we can see a little bit about the PhDs that are going on. And I needn't say a great deal here, I think, except to say there are a number of PhDs and they really are based on some very international connections. Let me go on to tell you a bit about one of those PhDs. So if we keep clicking, the next slide will appear. And this is a research topic by Fleur Ward. So I'm going to read out what Fleur has sent to us very kindly. So Fleur is in her third year of PhD research at the Institute for Northern Studies, and her PhD research is supported by the European Social Fund and the Scottish Funding Council as part of Developing Scotland's Workforce in Scotland 2014 to 2020, European Structural and Investment Fund programme. So Fleur's research explores the role of information and communications technology, or ICT, in island communities, and its themes include governance, connectivity, and ICT use. So the research sits within the discipline of island studies, and this is a relatively young field of inquiry, only formalised in the 1980s, and its interdisciplinary approach attempts to recognise, embrace, and cultivate islands as different from other places and worthy of investigation in their own right. So this research, alongside others, is an active pursuit of making sense of islands through open inquiries into islandness. That's a very good word. Also, international cooperation, networking, and comparative analysis. And the islands included in this research are classified as cold water islands located in the North Atlantic. So that's obviously Orkney, Shetland, and the Outer Hebrides, islands in the southwest of Ireland, and the Faroes. So moving to the next slide, Fleur's investigation focuses on the complex interplay between governance and ICT, that's information and communications technology. It asks if ICT can aid island businesses and community groups, and if it can promote rural vibrancy. Its aim is to understand the presence and roles of ICT in island communities, and also to assess the impact of ICT in various sectors, including community development, education, innovation, broadcasting, and media. The results will highlight community engagement with ICT, how it is used, what it communicates about specific islands and the whole region. And the benefit of this research to island communities will be the provision of strategic information concerning how to use and develop their own ICT systems. It will create an awareness of similar challenges and opportunities in other islands and create an opportunity where lessons can be learned from others' experiences. The research will impact on policy at local, regional, and national scales. So very much island-based research, but with which can be potentially very, very far-reaching. So that's fantastic, and thanks very much to Fleur for providing that. Let's move on to nearly my last slide before handing over. And I just want to highlight the role of the master's students at Heriot-Watt in undertaking research. This has been very difficult for them this year, given lockdown, and most of them have had to do desk-based studies. One who was able to get out in the field, she started very early, is Ciara Byford. So Ciara's research dissertation focused on the relationships between diet, intestinal parasites, and methane production in Northern European short-tailed sheep. Quite an unusual project. She was really warmly welcomed and helped on North Ronaldsay, where she was looking at the North Ronaldsay sheep, their behaviour, their diet, and their intestinal parasites. And she compared that with some Shetland sheep, actually just close to where I live, actually belonging to a neighbour here. Fascinating research, really interesting, and linking a number of issues related to climate action. I wish I had time to tell you more about that, but instead I'm going to move straight on to the next slide, just to tell you about other research that's being undertaken by PhD students in Orkney. Again, I don't have time to read out this slide, and that might be rather tedious, but you'll get a sense of the diversity of issues here. We've got social science, we've got biological science, we've got physical science, and all of this is very much applied to sustainable living. You'll also get a sense from the names there of quite how international this set of students is. So we have South America, the Middle East, the Southeast Asia, as well as the UK represented there and elsewhere in Europe. So I've spoken for quite long enough, and I'd like to hand over in the next slide to Jack to talk to us about his blue carbon research. Fantastic topic. So Jack, the floor is yours.
Hello. I didn't know that picture was going to be there. I don't know if that's me. It might be. Could I get the next slide, please? Yeah, so I'm doing a PhD in blue carbon, and here's a list of my lovely supervisors, including Mike Bell. And I should mention I'm also funded through the Natural Environment Research Council and through the Super DTP, and I do this PhD through ICIT here at Heriot-Watt University. Could I get the next slide, please? So a bit of background about myself. As mentioned before, I used to be a scuba diving instructor. My background is mostly marine biology, but also marine renewable energy. So I used to work also in consultancy, and most recently been helping out with economics and development appraisal here at the university. So I kind of find these things really kind of steered my research of blue carbon, which kind of led me towards policy context and ecological economics. Could I get the next slide, please? So the first thing I thought I'd do with the PhD was actually define and figure out what blue carbon is. So blue carbon was first used in 2009 and contextually introduced as a climate change mitigation tool. So it was introduced alongside brown, black, and green carbon. And it's most closely related to green carbon in many ways. Green carbon is carbon that's stored through natural processes such as photosynthesis in the natural world. And blue carbon is very much seen as green carbon, so biological carbon stores in the marine environment. And this text here at the bottom, this is actually taken from this first introduction as blue carbon as a term. And you realize, or you'll see that it makes reference to mangroves, marshes, and seagrasses, but also mentions marine sediments too. But it also doesn't really define what blue carbon is. And this has kind of caused some difficulties a little bit down the line, even to this day. Could I get the next slide, please? So this is a list of potential blue carbon habitats and species. So in addition to mangroves, marshes, and seagrass, we also have macroalgae, phytoplankton, coral reefs, and various marine fauna and flora. Some of them aren't included because of data gaps. Some are kind of more seen as geological rather than biological. Some don't offer long-term storage, and some have calcification effects, which are quite synergistic and complex. So they both store and release carbon dioxide at the same time. But the two main criteria for blue carbon used as a climate change mitigation tool in terms of how much carbon we can store through them or sequester through them is that they have to have significant greenhouse gas emissions removals and also long-term storage. And that's the two main criteria, because again, we kind of want to use these blue carbon stores for carbon accounting and then carbon trading to kind of work into that ecological economics aspect of blue carbon. Could I get the next slide, please? So to scope back out into climate change economics, I won't go into this in too much detail, but the main line I'd like you to look at here is the SCC, which stands for the social cost of carbon. And as we continue to pollute the atmosphere and release more carbon emissions into it, this cost of a damage from these emissions will increase. We kind of get some of these effects now, but in the future, those costs will become more and more significant. Another way of looking at it, though, is that if we can value carbon stores now and protect them, we can instead flip that around and view that as an appreciating asset, which can increase in value over time. And that's kind of the main point I'm trying to get here now with the blue carbon aspect of my research. Could I get the next slide, please? So these climate change economics fit very much into what's called the post-2015 development agenda of the UK. And this comprises the Paris Agreement, Sustainable Development Goals, and disaster risk reduction. And this is very much seen as getting away from a top-down approach of the Kyoto Protocol, which is seen as very much regulatory and do as you're told, towards a more of a bottom-up stakeholder engagement process through the Paris Agreement. So NDCs, these are nationally determined contributions, and these are basically our climate change mitigation targets. And through financial mechanisms and carbon trading, they're predicted to have the potential to reduce costs by more than half, which is valued at $250 billion a year by 2030. So it's quite a significant amount, but the other advantage of it is it's quite a tangible thing, which is more relevant to local stakeholders or stakeholders at all levels of the value chain with which we're engaging with. Can I get the next slide, please? So in addition to blue carbon being used for carbon sequestration and carbon trading, there's also other routes for which it has value. So on the left here, we have in blue carbon sequestration value. But on the right, in green and purple, we also have value and funding routes which are available for biodiversity and ecosystem function targets. So some of these might just be for biodiversity targets, but other ones can be for such things as disaster and climate risk reduction. So I mentioned before with the post-2050 agenda, one of the main ones is Sustainable Development Goals, but also disaster risk reduction. So again, there's some money in there which can be tapped into, and then again, use that to engage stakeholders. Can I get the next slide, please? So how might this work in practice? There's a couple of different ways, but some of the most interesting ones are through buyer preferences. So voluntary market offsets, they might work if you buy a flight somewhere. You then often have the option to offset the cost of your emissions. And normally that might be through planting trees in Brazil or the Amazon or wherever. But with blue carbon, we might also then be able to say you can protect some kelp or seagrass too. Corporate social responsibility is another one. So again, this links back to bottom-up engagement. So if we buy seafood, we might demand that that seafood is sourced sustainably, doesn't kill tuna or dolphins or anything other bycatch. And again, this relates to the bottom-up engagement. So buyer preference really determines what happens further up the value chain. So if we all demand that all our fish is sustainably sourced, higher up the value chain, the suppliers of that then have to then adjust their practices to match what we demand of them. One of the most interesting ones, I think, is insurance. So on the left here is a map of biological blue carbon in Orkney. And we might have communities that might have risks of fisheries collapses, and there's also storm and flood protection or risk damage as well in the future, especially with increasing climate change. So if we have communities that can then work out or include blue carbon in marine spatial planning processes and account for them in their portfolios, if they then try and get insurance premiums to protect them against fisheries collapses and storm and flood protection, storm and flood risk or damage, that value of the blue carbon resource might then be reflected in lower insurance premiums. So it's kind of a catch-all way to kind of get this total economic value. Could I get the next slide, please? So this total economic value of blue carbon, so it's not just the carbon sequestration potential, which we can then trade through markets, but also the value for ecosystem function and also through insurance and buyer preferences. And when we get this total economic value, we can then maybe expand the scope of blue carbon, not just to include mangroves, seagrass and saltmarsh, but also include a whole host of other habitats and species which might be more relevant to Scotland. And through doing this as well, we can also translate these values back to local stakeholders, which engage them and to make them more engaged with it and to make sure the products actually work. And this also, I think, drives home the point that if we get this stakeholder engagement, it's up to the individual rather than just top-down policy that actually drives societal change. And I think in this way, blue carbon is very much a microcosm of the wider climate change mitigation agenda, in terms of we often rely on top-down policy to determine how we deal with climate change, but we also have a responsibility as individuals and personally, and we have the power to do that as well, to actually make that change from the bottom up too. And that's just about it from me. I've got one more slide just for references, if you'd like to see that. And then I think I'd like to hand over to Katie, if that's all good.
Thanks, Jack. Yeah, if you could just go on to the next slide, please. And then the next one, please. Thank you. So hi, my name's Katie, and I'm also a PhD student at the Heriot-Watt Orkney campus. And I'm going to be talking to you a bit today about some of my research that I'm doing as part of my PhD, which focuses on interactions between inshore fisheries and aquaculture in Orkney, with the aim of establishing potential contamination pathways in commercially important crustacean species by using ecotoxicological approaches. sorry, if you could just go back to the first slide, thank you. And I should just say thanks to all the funders for this project. So this project's funded by the Scottish Fishermen's Trust, Mass Super DDP, which is through NERC, and we also have a number of partners on this project which are listed here. And also a special thanks to the Orkney local fishermen who are involved in this project, without who it wouldn't be possible. And unfortunately, I don't have any results to share with you today, thanks to COVID-19 lockdown, which put a stop to my summer fieldwork. But I just hope to give you a brief introduction to some of the research that I'm doing. So if you could just go to the next slide, please. So both Atlantic salmon aquaculture and inshore fisheries are two integral industries to Scotland. And Atlantic salmon aquaculture has ambitious targets to more than double production by 2030. And this industry is incredibly important both economically and socially in Scotland, employing over 2,300 people. Oh, could you go back, please? Sorry. And accounting for over 40% of food exports in Scotland. And this is particularly important in more rural areas, such as Orkney. And Orkney is home to 25 active salmon farms, which employs over 93 people in 2018. With an annual production of £117 million in 2018, which also saw a record year in terms of annual production of over 200,000 tonnes. Next slide, please. And inshore fisheries are no different. These are also extremely important to the economy and society in Scotland, providing employment, particularly in coastal rural areas, employing almost 5,000 people in 2018. Orkney is no different, and there are employs over almost 300, sorry, could you go back? Employs almost 300 people with over £17 million worth of landings in 2018. And one of the most important part of this overall fishery is the shell fishery in Orkney, which makes up the majority of the fishing fleet here. And one of the most important species of this shell fishery is brown crab, with Orkney boasting one of the UK's largest fisheries for this. And this also supports one of the UK's largest crab processing factories at Orkney Fishermen's Society in Stromness, and this employs over 130 people. Next slide, please. So the two species of interest of this project are the velvet crab Nicaracuba and the brown crab Canthopagurus. And these two, as I already mentioned about brown crab, are two very commercially important species, brown crab especially being one of the largest fisheries in terms of value and landings. And velvet crabs follow too shortly behind, sorry, could you go back, in terms as they're one of the most valuable by weight fisheries in Orkney. And they're also important because there's a large European market for velvet crab, with a majority exported live to Spain. And this is important in terms of this project, as both of these species are exported live. So some brown crab is exported live to China and a lot of velvet crab to European markets, as I mentioned. And this being said, it's very important that the health of these crabs is in great condition before they leave, to allow for survival when they get to their end destination. Next slide, please. So in recent years, some local fishermen have seen a notable increase in the prevalence and severity of black spot shell disease in some crabs in Orkney waters. And this is characterized by these black lesions you can see here on a velvet crab. And these unsightly lesions reduce the marketability of crabs, meaning they often have to be discarded, which results in an economic loss to the fishery, which I mentioned earlier is important as the majority of these are exported live. It's paramount that their health when they leave is in great condition. Next slide, please. Now this condition affects a range of crustacean species, in particular lobsters, crabs and shrimp. So it affects a lot of commercially important species, which is why it's of great interest. And this is caused by chitinolithic bacteria, which causes these perforations to the exoskeleton, causing these unsightly lesions. And though this occurs naturally in crustacean populations, it's unusual to see such a notable increase in particular areas over certain years. And areas of particular concern in Orkney, where we're seeing very high prevalences of this in recent years, is a bay adjacent to an Atlantic salmon farm, which raises concerns over a potential link between those two things. Next slide, please. We're also seeing an increase in the incidence of claw deformities, which you can see pictured here, affecting a velvet crab. And this again results in economic loss to the fishery due to reduced marketability, and also affects survival rates of affected crabs, which overall results in an economic loss to the fishery again. So, thank you. So areas we are looking into is potential legacy contaminants, which may be influencing these pathologies. And contaminants of concerns that we're interested in is heavy metals and sea lice therapeutics used by Atlantic salmon aquaculture. And in particular, emamectin benzoate, which is the active ingredient in the sea lice therapeutic slice. And both of these contaminants have been proved to have a range of toxicity in a number of crustaceans, as well as affecting the molting and limb regeneration in these two. Next slide, please. So the overall research aims of this project are to establish whether there is a link between these observed pathologies and contamination pathways in order to dismiss or corroborate concerns from local fishermen. We also aim to determine what the biological and environmental pathways of these legacy contaminants are in relation to the commercially important crustaceans, velvet crabs and brown crabs. We aim to map the spatial distribution of these conditions and determine the seasonal variation in order to establish areas of particularly high incidence and establish the environmental conditions of those areas. So the results of this project aim to provide vital evidence to concerned shell fisheries management, regulators, stakeholders and policymakers. Next slide, please. So to do this, I'll be carrying out onboard observer trips on commercial fishing vessels throughout the year, weather depending, of course. And here I'll be, like I say, mapping the spatial distribution of the prevalence of black spot shell disease and claw deformities in both velvet crabs and brown crabs within the fishery in order to identify those areas or hotspots of high prevalence with the aim of establishing the environmental conditions of those areas. So I'll be doing onboard health assessments of crabs, measuring the usual parameters, including size, carapace width, sex, limb loss, percentage cover of black spot, presence of claw deformities and overall condition. And to estimate the financial impact these pathologies are having on the fishery, I'll be estimating the weight of discards as the result of these conditions. So next slide, please. To determine the environmental conditions, I will be taking crab tissue samples caught from areas of high prevalence, as well as sediment samples from these areas using grab sampling. And both of these will be analysed for the legacy contaminants of concern, so emamectin benzoate, as I already mentioned, and heavy metals. And this will be done in collaboration with the University of Highlands and Islands in Thurso, using high-performance liquid chromatography for emamectin benzoate and inductively coupled plasma atomic emission spectroscopy for the heavy metals. And we'll also be interested in looking at characterising the sediment of these areas to determine whether this is having any effect on the occurrence of black spot shell disease. And this is interesting because we know that certain types of sediment increase the susceptibility of crustaceans to bacterial infection. For example, larger grain size particles have increased abrasive properties, which would increase the chance of secondary bacterial infection. Next slide, please. And so to establish the exposure routes of these legacy contaminants in crustaceans, we'll be doing some lab exposure studies. And this will help to determine and obtain some baseline data on the toxicokinetics of these legacy contaminants, emamectin benzoate and heavy metals. And this will help to determine the uptake and depuration rates in organisms, so how quickly these contaminants are taken up and how quickly they naturally get rid of them, as well as the tissue residency time. So this refers to how long these contaminants stay in organisms' tissues. And we'll be using model crab organisms depending on survival trials. So to begin with, we're going to trial some velvet crabs and see how well they survive in lab conditions. However, I'm not too optimistic, as I know they're very aggressive, so I'm not sure how likely they are to survive. So we're going to trial a few different organisms and hopefully go with one that works the best. And so we'll be doing some acute exposures, so exposing crabs to contaminants within their feed, as well as chronic exposures, where we'll be exposing organisms to environmentally relevant levels of contaminants within sediments over a longer period of time. And we'll also be doing some dose response experiments where we'll use variable concentrations of these contaminants in order to determine the different physiological responses, such as mortality and visible signs of black spot shell disease and pleurodeformities, and effects on molting, as well as other stress responses and behavioural responses. So next slide, please. So that was just a very quick whistle-stop tour of my research, but if anyone would like to know anything more, please feel free to get in touch. My email's just there, and I look forward to hearing any of your questions. Thank you.
That was excellent. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. Fascinating. You know, I just wish we had a little bit more time to hear more about your projects. You know, that was really interesting. Thank you so much. Well, we've been getting quite a number of questions coming in. So we've got a little bit of time before the close of session to go through a few. There's some for you individually, and there's some possibly you can decide amongst yourselves who would be best to answer. Great. So we've got, we'll start with a question first for Katie, if that's okay. And Martin asks, are there any signs of red king crabs near Orkney waters?
I haven't seen any, but I might not be the best person to ask. I'm not sure, maybe Mike might know more about this, as he does a lot more work in the general fisheries area, but I haven't seen anything personally.
Yeah, I could just add to that. I've not heard of it. I don't say it's not that they're not there, and I think it's entirely possible that they could be there, as there are range shifts, and it's a species that I wouldn't be surprised to see turn up in Orkney, but we have no news of it so far. Fishermen might tell you otherwise. It should be a much more reliable source of information.
Excellent, thank you. Great, we'll move on to our next question. I'll just see what we've got here. Question for all of you. Universities were traditionally based in cities with occasional field trips to the natural environment. Is what's happening in Orkney a sign of change?
Shall I take that question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure it's a sign of change, because it's well, for example, Heriot-Watt have had a presence in Orkney for around about 30 years now. It first had a presence in Orkney back in 1989. And over that time, there's been some hundreds, if not thousands, of students that have gone through ICIT. That's who we are, International Centre for Island Technology. Now, we're quite different from the usual city model of university in that we don't take undergraduates. What we take are postgraduate students. So it's our remit is very much research and teaching. So they're smaller numbers, and we certainly couldn't host and wouldn't have the facilities for the much larger numbers. Now, the other element, of course, is UHI, and UHI is built on a very different model to the traditional universities. In terms, really, I think for a lot of UHI studies, you can be anywhere within the Highlands and Islands, I guess, and study courses hosted by any of the campuses. It's a very different model to the traditional city-based universities. And I think that as we're, particularly over this last year, the way we've had to adapt to lockdown and having to find virtual ways of teaching and learning, that kind of dispersed model is probably going to reflect what's going to happen more generally. I don't think that's going to be to the detriment of the traditional universities, but it certainly opens up new opportunities.
Excellent, thank you, Mike. Great. We've got a question for Jack now. A question for Jack from Bill Graham. How did you collect the data for the density of the Orkney blue carbon habitat?
So that data is actually from a report published earlier this year, which I actually wasn't involved in, but it's from various sources. So some of it is dive data, and some of it is from modeling. So we know the parameters of certain species and how and where they might exist. So it's kind of based on predictive modeling of where those species might be and what densities they might be too. So it's a mix of some tangible data and then using that to feed into modeling software.
Great, thank you, Jack.
You're muted, Heather.
You're muted, yes.
Oh dear, terrible. I mean, days of hosting, and I'm still learning things. Oh dear. Thank you for that. Okay, we'll move on to our next question. Yes, we've got a question now, possibly from Mike, I think. How do you think that the human resource you referred to at the beginning, which is a blend of Indigenous Orcadians and incomers, how does that benefit Orkney?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and thanks for that. And there's lots of different ways I could take that question. I'm guessing it's not a kind of existential question of what good are humans, which is a perfectly reasonable question. I'll take that in the context of the student body that I illustrated above the word human resource there. And again, I think there's a number of ways we could tackle that question. One thing I think is that the student body adds enormously to the Orkney community. And I think if you, certainly in Stromness, you know, of an evening, you go up, there's a real buzz around, you know, particularly when the new students arrive and all the connections that they make and the contributions they make to the culture. And it's really good that we do have this mix of both Indigenous Orcadians and people from all over the world. And it's going to be really fascinating to see who turns up next week and the international connections that they have. More generally, I think there's a lot of research which is taking Orkney as a kind of case study and is directly benefiting Orkney industry. A lot of it's actually based on questions asked by Orkney industry, whether it's the fishing industry or the renewables industry. They have questions, they have needs, they have problems that they need to solve. And our student body can actually help with that and really set a research agenda. There's probably lots of other ways. I won't go on about it, but in my view that that the human resource, whether Indigenous or the incoming community, particularly in the student body, is really integral to how Orkney is as a place.
Excellent, thank you, Mike. That was very interesting question, yes. Okay, let's see what we've got here. I'm trying to make sure you all get questions equally, so not one of you speaking more than the other. Let's see, we've got another question for Katie, and the question is, with Brexit and more control over our fisheries, do you think the value of employment potential will increase, and by how much? Ooh, interesting question.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer. I'm personally not really sure, to be honest. It would be lovely to see if it did increase employment, you know, locally. But I suppose it's one of those things, you know, we'll have to wait and see, but I'm not really sure myself, to be honest. Sorry, I can't answer that any better than that, but it would be great to see, but I couldn't say possibly what's going to happen.
Well, it's always difficult with a lot of uncertainty to say anything for sure. Absolutely. Thank you, Katie. Okay, we've got another one here. Let's see. There is a growing public concern about the adverse impact of fish farming. How do you see its future? Who would like to answer that?
Yeah, I will, if that's okay. Yeah, I agree there is growing public concern about it. And like I mentioned in my presentation, Scottish aquaculture is aiming to grow, well, over double production in the next 10 years, which is quite a high, ambitious target. And I think for the industry to continue growing as quickly as it wants to, I think maybe there needs to be a bit more stricter regulation on a lot of these environmental impacts that are still quite misunderstood and understudied. So for my research, personally, I hope that it provides evidence to see what's going on and how things can be better regulated.
Excellent, thank you, Katie. Okay, we've got a couple about blue carbon here now for Jack. The first one is, has the impact of the catastrophic destruction of a blue carbon sink region, for example, major pollution incident been considered?
So blue carbon is kind of it's the latest in ecological economics, which is kind of first, or contingent evaluation, which kind of first kicked off by the Exxon Valdez oil spill. So I guess from that, yes, but in terms of how blue carbon works now, it's more about protecting it from predicted or foreseeable events rather than unforeseeable events. So it could be included if there was a major pollution incident which degraded these habitats, but unless they're already accounted for and quantified, that might be a little bit difficult to account for. The other thing with blue carbon is it's also in coastal waters, quite shallow waters. So they'll always be in a national jurisdiction of some description. So even if there was damage, if it's not accounted for, there'd still be some accountability regardless of that, I think. But in terms of how that works, I wouldn't be able to say specifically.
Great, thank you, Jack. And we've got another one for you there. And we've got a comment from someone saying, it's the first time I've heard of the term blue carbon and its concept. And they're asking, how is this concept being marketed to the general public?
It's not being marketed too much just at the moment. It's still kind of in its early iteration. So it's mostly used in developing countries. So it's mangrove salt marshes and salt marsh. So in terms of how it works, it's kind of more to prevent destruction through development. In terms of where it is now in Scotland, we're still trying to work out exactly what we can include as blue carbon and what we can then include to then get that value back to local stakeholders. So I think now, in terms of how it's marketed, we're trying to go down more the route of not just carbon sequestration, but we can do that through various companies such as, so I've talked a little bit with Community Energy Scotland. They might be interested in doing some carbon trading or helping us do that, but also through insurance premiums and buyer preferences. But like I said, it's still kind of at early stages and we still need to get a lot more data and be more certain to actually do this, because we have to have certainty to trade these carbon credits in the markets. And if you don't have that certainty, it doesn't really work.
Gosh, fascinating stuff. Thank you, Jack. Excellent. Okay, we've got a few more questions. We've just got just under 5 minutes before we need to start wrapping up, I'm afraid. But we've still got plenty of questions, but we'll see how many we can get through before we run out of time. Okay, so we've got a question for everyone, I think. Do you have examples of other recognised living laboratories around the world?
I think a good example of this as well. Jack and myself went on a field trip as part of our masters, which was through the University of Terengganu, I believe. And this involved a sort of 2-week stay on a remote island where we surveyed the coral reefs and the organisms on it. So that's how I think of a living laboratory, as well as obviously what ICIT is and OPNI. So that's an example I can give, but I'm not sure if the others have anything else to add to that.
I could add a little bit. I think that's a really good example, Katie. And in a similar part of the world, I think we could look on a much larger scale than OPNI at Indonesia as a real, you can't call it a microcosm because it's absolutely, Indonesia is vast in terms of its spatial extent and its population, but it's a real center for a lot of world leading research. So at the moment, we're looking at how some of the blue carbon research might be extended to Southeast Asia and specifically around some of the Indonesian sites. And there's a lot of what's the equivalent of World Heritage sites. The name escapes me. Marine biosphere reserves. There's a lot of those in Southeast Asia and in Indonesia in particular. That's just one example. There are lots of areas of the world. It does often happen to be kind of island situations where you get these kind of clusters of issues, resources, and ways of relating to the environment. And the beauty of islands is that you can draw a line around them. There's an obvious boundary, and that makes for a really good basis for doing this kind of research.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Katie. That was great. Well, we've got time for just the one question, I'm afraid, and it's a it's a good one. It's sort of coming off of that last living laboratory idea, and someone's asking if Orkney is a living laboratory. Should we residents think of ourselves as guinea pigs or something else?
Shall I take that one, Heather? Well, I suppose one answer to that could be yes. There's one bit of research I didn't mention is being done by a master's by research student, and a lot of Orkney residents may have come across Alice, and she has been looking at how consultation works in Orkney. Paradoxically, she's kind of using a consultation process itself to address that particular question. And I think, in a sense, the answer to that has to be yes, Orkney residents are guinea pigs in one sense, but a more positive way to look at that is that Orkney and how it relates to its environment and its resources can really be a world leader. Now, this population is only, it's a little bit more than 20,000 now. It's tiny in terms of the UK and worldwide. But you go worldwide and you will actually find people who recognise Orkney and who know about the work that's being done here, whether it be renewables, seafood, or a lot of other issues. And I think what we're doing here in terms of the living laboratory is actually acting as a kind of ambassador for Orkney out there, and can only be a good thing. So guinea pigs, kind of yes, but it's a good thing.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. What can I say? Quality over quantity, eh? Great. Well, I'm afraid that's the end of the session, and I'll just say a massive thank you to all of our three speakers this morning, Dr. Mike Bell, Jack Sheeny, and Katie Cubbon. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you at the Orkney International Science Festival. Great. Well, excellent. I'm looking at my sheet here, and we've still got spaces available for PD Kirk lunch events this week and next week, and also at our evening festival club table sessions. So if you'd like to relax around one of our virtual tables and meet some of the festival speakers, please do register and join us. And these links can be found underneath the PD Kirk's lunch event on the festival's website, and I believe in the live YouTube chat as well. And of course, please, save it and come along this evening to the festival club. And of course, if you are enjoying the festival, please do like us on Facebook and please follow our YouTube channel. And thank you so much to everyone asking questions. Fascinating, really good stuff. And thank you so much for attending. And I hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.